Daniel chapter 5, and we will remind ourselves where we left off in Daniel chapter 4, because I think it plays quite a bit into the story we look at here in chapter 5. If you're visiting, by the way, and this is your first Sunday with us, we've been looking at the exile and seeing a lot of parallels in how the exile of the people of God in Babylon is kind of like the way we may feel about our world sometimes, where you just feel like it is not a world that you're at home in, and you're not always sure how you fit and what to do and what it thinks about being a Christian and all of those things. And I think we see a lot of parallels in exile in the book of Daniel. So starting in Daniel chapter 4, in verse 37, this is after Nebuchadnezzar has had the dream. Daniel has interpreted the dream. He has realized the error of his ways after going out and living like a wild man, or like with the animals out in the open, and then comes back to his senses. And toward the end of that chapter, he says this: "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." And if you think of how far things have come there in Babylon by the time we get to the end of chapter 4, where God's people are taken out of their land, everything that's there in Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple's destroyed, they pull all of the artifacts of the temple out and bring them to Babylon to have kind of as plunder. They have tried to demand all these different ways of life of God's people there in Babylon. If you guys could turn me up just a hair back there. They've tried to destroy their way of life, to retrain them in the ways of Babylon. And now you have the king himself, toward the end of chapter 4, realizing this God that those guys were serving, this God that we were trying to destroy the people of, is the God. And this is the one that we should serve. And then, between chapter 4 and chapter 5, about 30 years pass. And that Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in power, and we're going to have a new king come on the scene. And as is often the case in Bible times, and I think probably in our times too, it doesn't take a lot of time passing for us to forget what we've learned. I can remember the first time my kids came home with algebra homework, and I thought to myself, I had an A in algebra as an 8th grader, and I was an 8th grader a very, very long time ago. And they put this stuff in front of me, and I thought, I have no idea. Talk to your mom. She'll figure this out. And then we found an awful lot of, mom figured a lot out, but then we would call grandma because grandma was a math teacher, and she would figure out even more. I forgot a lot. And so in these 30 years that pass, Nebuchadnezzar is going from God is the Most High, God is the One, to the new king seeing things entirely differently. So in chapter 5, verse 1, it says that King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So think again, echoing the words that we just heard in the previous verse. Even though it's 30 years earlier, for us, we're just turning a page in our Bibles, if that. Those who walk in pride. Could there be anything more than walking in pride in the way this banquet is described? He made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. It's almost like he's on display there for everyone to see the wealth and the opulence and all of the things that he had and how great his kingdom was. And the irony of it all is what he does not realize is just outside, the Persians are planning their attack. The Persians are ready to come in, they're ready to take over, and he doesn't understand what's coming. And there he is, just having this great banquet in the midst of it all, and who knows exactly why? There are those that have the theory that he actually did know that the other kingdoms were coming, and he was just trying to live out the last day as best he could. But most of the history that we see is that this was a surprise attack. So I'm going to guess he is just unaware of what is going on around him because he is so overtaken by his own pride. And isn't that us at times? Don't we have those moments where we're just missing the bigger picture because we're so caught up in ourselves and how everything affects us? So Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So all of these things that were taken out of the temple are going to be brought in to use as props to show his wealth and his power. And I want you to think back a little bit about the Old Testament as we know it. So all of these things are first fashioned, the holiness that is attached to them. The fact that where they are in the tabernacle and then later in the temple, only certain people are allowed to use these things at certain times. Not just anybody can grab these, even the people of God. If you think about the times where people misuse the things of God, you think about Uzzah walking alongside the ark, being dragged on the cart, and it begins to fall, and he goes to catch it, and he's struck down. You think about the Philistines who feel like that they have conquered, and they have brought the Ark of the Covenant back into their temple to Dagon, and they wake up one morning, and Dagon's statue is face down in front of the ark, and they think, well, that's odd. And then they put it back up and put everything where it was, and they come back in the next morning, and there's Dagon's statue face down as if it's worshiping the Ark of God again. And they realize this thing is bad news. And so they hook it up on a cart and they send it back to Israel to get it out of their temple. And now here is Belshazzar saying, let's bring all this in and we'll make this part of our party. And we'll take these artifacts, these things of God's people, and we will use them for our own. So then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So not only do they use them, but they actually used them with the intent of serving their own gods. This is kind of like what the Philistines did with the ark, where they brought it into this temple where another god was worshipped, and God was not okay with that. So now these different vessels are brought in, and they're using them to worship their gods. They are committing idolatry. They're before God. They're breaking one of the original laws. One of those early ones of, don't make idols, don't have gods before me, and here they are doing all of those things. And probably thinking to themselves, this is about as good as it gets, isn't it? This is Belshazzar and his wives and concubines and everybody. They're living out a modern-day Super Bowl beer commercial. They are all there. They're just living it up. Everything is just right. Everything is good. They're so excited about life, and they just feel like no one can touch us. We are in charge. We can have everything any way we want, and then everything changes in an instant. In the next verse it says, in Isaiah, just to remind ourselves a little bit here, I am the Lord, that is my name, my glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. God is not okay with idolatry. He says it twice in Isaiah and other times, but two we'll look at. In chapter 48 and verse 11, he says, for my own sake, I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. His glory will not be given to another. And as we talked about a little bit in class this morning, as kind of been a recent theme, it seems like, between classes and sermons, we can see these things so clearly in other people, can't we? I made the joke as we began here, everyone in Ada thinks they're a good driver. And yet you have encountered enough to realize not everyone in Ada is a good driver. Now, all of us, clearly, we're good drivers. But everybody else out there, they're just not quite on board. And yet they think they are. And for us, we will look to people like the Philistines, and we will think, who would take the ark of God and put it in the temple of their God? Or we think of people like Belshazzar and all of these Babylonians and think, who would take these vessels that were made for a holy purpose and bring them in and use them for something that is not at all for God, that puts something else first? We would never do anything like that, would we? And yet for us, there are times where we give the glory that should be given to God to someone or something else, or maybe sometimes to ourselves. So to the next verse, it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. I think sometimes when we read these things on a page, we lose the effect just a little bit. I tinkered for a while with trying to make a PowerPoint thing that would come up that would begin to write right now. I couldn't get it right. What would we do as we sat here and talking about whatever we're talking about if suddenly just a hand appeared and began to write something on the wall? How shocking would that be? How much would we think, whatever it is I'm doing at this moment, and we maybe have had something like that along the way where you're doing something and then there's something that just stops you in your tracks. I mentioned the drivers driving across flooded roadways. I wonder at what point as they're moving sideways they begin to think, well, this was not a good idea. I remember vividly the first time I drove in an ice storm. I was driving a 15-passenger van full of chorus students at Harding. I was, I think, 19 or 20 driving this van, pulled up to a gas station in St. Louis on a sheet of ice, never having driven on ice before, parked the van, got ready to get out and put gas in it, and I realized the van was going sideways. And I thought, I don't have brakes for that. Sideways, I don't know what to do with that. And I started the van up, went around to another pump with a little less ice, put gas in it. When we got back on the road, I said to everyone on my van, I'm from Alabama. I've never driven on ice before. I know we're usually fun on a van, but if you'd be a little more quiet, I'd appreciate it. And you could have dropped a pin inside that van. We knew there was a problem. So Belshazzar, he does all of this. The hand begins to write on the wall, and it says, then the king's color changed. And I would imagine this is not something that happens very frequently for this king. I think he is so sure of himself at all times that you never see him seeming as if something unexpected has just happened. He seems like the one that's going to take things in stride, look like he's in control. The king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. I remember first starting out leading singing when I was probably 15 or 16, Wednesday nights at church. And I would stand locked behind this podium, and it was bigger there, thank goodness, and my knees would just shake. Scared to death to be up there. I finally asked a dentist that was at our church, does that ever, when does that stop? At what point? Because he seemed like a good song leader, had it all together. He said, if it does at some point, I'll let you know. You're always just a little bit nervous, a little unsure. Belshazzar's not used to this. And so he sees this hand begin to write on the wall, and he's not sure exactly what's going on, but he knows that he's afraid. And so he now has fear, which for him is not a normal thing. For us, we maybe have a little too much fear in life at times, but Belshazzar's fear is of the unknown, the uncontrolled, what has caused this, any number of things. Now we know from the Word of God that fear can do some good things for us too. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the wise man says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And all of those stories of God's people that have led up to Daniel chapter 5, this is kind of how it works, isn't it? When they are fearful of God, when they understand, respect, honor God, things go well for them. And when they don't, and they start to ignore his commandments, things go poorly for them. And so as we respect God and do the right things, things go well. So we want to fear God and keep his commandments. And then the next verse says this, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he says every secret thing, and maybe this is something that we can connect with a little bit more. We're not throwing opulent parties with the vessels from the temple. But a lot of us have things that we think are secret, that no one knows. And I think God would tell us he knows. And if he were to begin to write on the wall and our knees were to begin to shake, he knows whatever it is that we have put ahead of him, whatever thing is the idol for us. And it's not a statue, and it's not the things of the temple, but we all have our idols of one kind or another. So in verse 13, in the meantime, the king has been told about Daniel by the queen. She says there's this wise guy of the Israelites, and he interprets dreams and does all these things. You should talk to him. And so it says in verse 13 that Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. And he begins to let Daniel know that he knows a little of what Daniel has done. He details a little bit of that out for him. And down to verse 17, after he has offered Daniel some gifts, he said, Daniel, if you can interpret this, let me know what's going on. You'll have all this, we'll put purple on you, and we'll give you gold, and we'll do all these great things. And Daniel says, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So he says, your gifts, they sound nice and all, but let's not worry about that. I believe, as I read the whole story, at least in part because Daniel realizes he's not really going to have the authority to give anybody gifts for very much longer, so it's not going to matter. And secondly, maybe I don't want these gifts to be looking royal as the other guys are coming in, because I don't really want to be attached to this king right now. But for whatever reason, maybe Daniel just wants to let him know, I'm not telling you this because I want something. I'm telling you this because it's true. And so he tells the king this, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed. Whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up. And whom he would, he humbled. And so you see the phrasing here of Nebuchadnezzar, God gave him these things. He gave them to him. And if you remember, if you were here last time, that was kind of what Nebuchadnezzar had to work through, wasn't it? Because early on in the story, it was, look at how great I am. And by the end of the story, it was, look at how great God is. And Belshazzar has not kept hold of that lesson. And unfortunately, there are too many people in our world today who have not held on to that lesson. They feel like, look at what I have done. Look at how great I am. Look at what I've done for myself, what I've done for others. Look at all that my talent, my ability, my gifts have brought here. And we forget about God, who works within all that and gives us what we have. So he says down in verse 20, when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne and his glory was taken from him. So he relays this whole story about Nebuchadnezzar, about how he got it and then he didn't get it. And then God made things happen so that he would get it again. So he was brought down. God brought him up, brought him to power, and God brought him down to the point where he was in the outside, living with animals, and just a complete mess. And God still has the authority and the ability to do that to anybody. You don't have to look far around our world to see people who think they are in complete control. And we could start at the top with people like Belshazzar or Nebuchadnezzar, people who are kings or presidents or governors or whatever they may be, who feel like they're untouchable. And God could undo that immediately. And I think we could see throughout history times where he has. And then on a smaller scale, within our own lives and within our own worlds, we experience people like that too. And God can change that immediately as well. So in verse 22 he says, and you his son Belshazzar have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You knew. That's when it gets tough, isn't it? It's one thing when you're driving along and you think to yourself, I don't know what's going on. The last ticket I got was driving through North Little Rock, Arkansas. I was driving along from Searcy. I was on my way, I think, to Dallas, if I remember right. And I was listening to a Tom Clancy book on cassette. Remember those? And it was so interesting. And I was so involved in the book that I missed the sign when it went from the highway speed limit to the you're now in the city speed limit. And then I saw the blue lights. And I thought, oh, man, I just missed it. I didn't know. And then there are other times where as you're going along, you think, well, that speed limit's kind of a suggestion. They'll give you 7. They'll give you 10, whatever you've created in your mind. And I'll be fine. And then the blue lights come on. Did you know? Or when it comes to sin, there is sin that sometimes you accidentally stumble into. And there is sin that sometimes you know. There are things of God that sometimes we know the right thing or the wrong thing, and we ignore it even though we knew. And that's where Belshazzar is. He knew. Even though 30 years had passed, this is not a story that people did not know and did not understand the reason of why it all happened. And then, sure enough, he is right back to where Nebuchadnezzar started with all of the pride, and it's all about him. So verse 23 said, but you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. You did not honor God. If there's one message from all of this morning, maybe we need to take a long, hard look in the mirror and think, is the way I'm living, is it honoring God? Because first and foremost, above everything else for Belshazzar and all those people who are with him, they are not honoring God. The God who can give kings power and take it away. The God who has proven himself again and again in our lives. Are we honoring God? So verse 24 it says, then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And the writing, this is the writing that was inscribed, many, many tekel and parsin. And it means this handwriting on the wall that came, and the king wondered, what is this all about? In verse 26, Daniel says, this is the interpretation of the matter. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. So everything you thought you had is about to be gone. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. What great imagery. What if our life was weighed? Would we be found wanting? Would we be found true? In Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So there is coming on you judgment. And if there is no other place in the story, maybe we can connect with Belshazzar and the people of Babylon. There will at some point in time come on us judgment for the way that we have lived. And with that handwriting on the wall, he realizes the judgment is there and there's no avoiding it at this point. In Isaiah chapter 40, in verse 22, it says, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows on them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. God is over all of that. And then in verse 29, Belshazzar sees. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So that very night, the judgment came down on him. And Darius the Mede, who we will remember from chapter 6, we were a little out of order a few weeks ago, with Daniel in the lion's den, Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. That very night, it happened. He's having a party, everything seems just right. Handwriting on the wall, he's suddenly fearful, doesn't know what to do, and by the end of that night, his life is done. What would be written on your wall? A few questions for us as we bring this together. What would be written on your wall? I'm not asking you to come up with some language you don't know and how it would be translated, but if God were to use that handwriting on the wall moment for you, what would he write? What would it take to get your attention? For him to let you know that he knows. For him to let you know that he is in control, he is in power, or whatever you think it is that you can be proud of that you have, that he actually is the one who gives. It's not us that have done those things. Secondly, what are your idols? Now, if I were God and I were writing the handwriting on your wall, this is probably how I would write it. If I was writing on my wall too, rather than something to translate, I'd probably start listing them off. Because we look at idolatry all throughout the Old Testament, and we think to ourselves, well, that's something of the past. People don't do that anymore. But we have our own idols, don't we? Those things that we put ahead of God, those things that we allow to rise to a level of importance that almost makes them a thing that we worship. And I don't know what they are for you. We've talked about some in here in the past. We get that way. Fall's coming up. I didn't preach this one in the fall. Fall's coming up. We get that way with football and our teams and all that kind of stuff. Some of us, when we go back to school, it's an academics kind of thing. Some of us, it's work, family, any number of things. And you will notice, by the way, with a lot of these things, not bad in and of themselves, it's when we allow them to become the idols that suddenly they take on a place that they should have never taken on, which is the third question. Are you honoring God with your life? Is God being honored first and foremost, or is something else? Is God being honored first and foremost, or is it self? What are we honoring in our lives? Are we honoring God? So this morning, if you are not honoring God in your life, the wonderful news with that is you can change that. Those things that get in the way of God, you can stop following those first and instead look to God first. If you're not honoring God with your life, you can change, as Jet mentioned this morning, the idea of thinking about our prayers again. What are our prayers about? Do we have a moment in there where it is God and who he is and what he has done and honoring that, or is it just straight to what I need and how I need God to help me with something? And all of those things are good things to pray for, but what are our prayers about? What is the way that we talk about? Does the way we talk honor God? Or does the way we talk try to win the argument? Or does the way we talk try to convince people that we're right and they're wrong? When we're driving around Ada with everyone else who knows how to drive, does the way we drive honor God? I might need to come forward this morning. Does the way we drive honor God, or is it something else? When we make our schedules, do our schedules honor God? Or is it just God getting a little bit of what's left over at the end? Because when that's how we treat God, we are struggling with idolatry every bit as much as anyone we read about in the Old Testament. This morning, if you have never followed him, he wants you to follow him, to make him first and foremost. He would like to see you baptized into him, for your life to be one that is honoring him in everything that you do. Or if, like so many, you have found yourself getting caught up in all the idols of the world, change that today. Drop those and come back to him. Put him ahead of everything else and honor him as we stand and as we sing.